So let's talk a little bit about the state of the African economies of Sub-Saharan Africa. Nigeria, South Africa, and Angola are three major commodity economies in Africa, but three of them are currently lagging behind other economies that are making more faster growth on the continent. In a new report released this week by the International Monetary Fund in Abuja, Nigeria's political capital, we had a bit of a sit-down interview with the IMF Africa Director, Bebe Selassie, to talk to us more about whether this lag by Nigeria, South Africa, and Angola will be contagious. How long will it last? What about inclusive growth? What about Nigeria specifically? And what should we be prepared for in the global headwinds in mid to long term? This is my one-on-one with Bebe Selassie. Take a listen.
The latest report, and taking a cue from the just concluded World Bank IMF spring meetings, that about three African countries or economies are Nigeria, South Africa, and Angola, three resource economies are dragging the rest of the SSA. How long do you think this drag on the rest of the continent will continue?
That's a good question. So, you know, what you're drawing on is that Sub-Saharan Africa's growth this year is estimated to be around 3.5% compared to 3% last year. So for the region as a whole, when you look at the regional aggregates, we're seeing some growth in, some acceleration in economic growth, but not quite to the healthy levels that we used to have before 2014. One reason why the average growth number continues to be lower than in the past is because, as you noted, growth in Nigeria, South Africa, and Angola remains very modest. How long this will continue, you know, on current policies, we see basically growth in these three large economies, particularly in Angola and South Africa, remaining at around the 3% mark over the medium term. But with policy reforms, we do think that they will be able to accelerate a bit more and enjoy higher growth. So it all depends on the policy reforms we're going to be seeing.
Do you think if these growth lag in these three countries remain over a midterm, do you think is there a fear of contagion?
I think first and foremost, the bigger impact will be on those countries themselves. Okay, so the higher growth that the populations need in those countries will not be forthcoming. Now, Angola has confronted its policy challenges head-on, and we are seeing a lot of the macroeconomic reforms that the country needs being put in place. So we do think growth will recover over the medium term. And in Nigeria and South Africa also, we're quite hopeful that we'll let with Nigeria elections out of the way and South Africa elections coming soon. Some of the more difficult reforms that are needed to engender higher private investment can be put in place so the countries can enjoy higher growth.
For South Africa specifically, what are your concerns at the IMF?
You know, what we've seen in South Africa basically is that, the calibration of macroeconomic policies, the setting of monetary fiscal policy has generally been reasonable, broadly supportive of growth. But there's been quite a lot of uncertainty, which has been, about the policy environment, about the political environment in the past, that has been a drag on private investment. These uncertainties need to be alleviated to allow private investment to recover. And it's really the fall in private investment that's been holding growth down there.
Based on what the research and all that at the IMF looking at, do you think we're beginning to see a major shift in East Sub-Saharan Africa economic leadership from these big three, Nigeria, South Africa, and Angola, to other countries within the sub-region?
Okay, so I think this has been going on for quite a while. It's just that the bigger countries dominate the regional aggregate so much that you haven't noticed the fact that you've had countries like Ethiopia, Tanzania in the past, Senegal, Cote d'Ivoire that have been growing fairly rapidly over the last many years. What we are seeing right now is that even though the regional number is at 3.5, we still have quite a lot of countries, about 21, 22 countries that grow 5% or more at a very rapid clip. And really, this has been true for the last 15, 20 years, that you've seen quite a large number of countries continuing to enjoy fairly robust growth.
Do you think growth in these smaller countries are sustainable, in your view?
Absolutely. I mean, it really depends on the policy environment that countries are pursuing. What we see in those rapidly growing countries is that in many of these cases, growth has been led by strong investment in public infrastructure in particular. So governments have been investing quite a bit in infrastructure. And what the policy requirement to sustain this growth now is that to hand over the reins of growth from the public to the private sector. So, easing off on the governments being the main driver of growth and allowing more private sector growth. But I think we are reasonably confident that these countries can sustain their growth.
Is it very surprising to you when you look at these two small countries in West Africa, Senegal and Benin Republic, Nigeria's neighbor, becoming a major economic growth?
Not really. One thing I always ask myself about, is why aren't these countries growing at 7%? Given how low per capita income is in many of our countries in the region, given so much potential that our countries have, the question we should be asking is why isn't every country growing at 7%? So really, in terms of how we approach any analysis, any policy recommendation, it is what is required to allow this country to grow at 7%. So no, I'm not surprised. Not at all. I mean, every country should be growing at 7% ideally.
But what do you think with the current growth that we're seeing in a number of East, West, and the Horn of Africa, in terms of growth, do you think we're back to this narrative of Africa rising? Do you think is a rebirth?
I'm always hesitant to use these kind of labels. In the so-called Africa Rising period, we had very diverse economic growth numbers also, which is what you have now also. At that time, as I said, it really is the big change in narrative is the slower growth that some of the larger economies are now experiencing. So, if you abstract from that, if you take from the regional numbers, the South Africa and Nigeria numbers out, you're still seeing, growth at 5% for the region as a whole. So that's exactly the nuance, the message that we're bringing out in our report.
The growth that we've seen in Africa, in a number of African countries over the last few years, or what you could describe as paper growth in some terms. These are not non-inclusive growth, which growth that are not really lifting millions out of poverty. So, how much more will the IMF be ready and willing to do to make sure that the current wave of growth are inclusive growth in nature?
Okay, so I want to correct something. I mean, first, it's really important not to generalize the nature of growth across the regions. I think the extent to which growth has been poverty reducing has been quite varied. So we have seen in some countries like Uganda, Ethiopia, Rwanda, there's been some impact, there's been quite a bit of impact from growth on poverty. But across the region, really, really important, in most countries in the region, what we have seen is that this growth has been accompanied by really important improvements in human development outcomes. So we've seen infant mortality rates, maternal mortality rates, these things which have blighted our countries declining, life expectancy increasing in the region as a whole. So I would be careful about characterizing growth as not having had tangible benefits. That's the first point I want to make. Second, in terms, yes, there are indeed cases where the benefits of growth hasn't translated enough in poverty reduction, or the benefits have accrued more to richer segments of society. This has often been in situations where the growth has come from small sectors, like say the mining sector, as was the case in Mozambique, for example, for a period of their recent economic history. So what is needed is like the continuing to diversify. Economic diversification, we think, is really, really important to make sure that the benefits of growth can accrue to as many people as possible. Also, of course, pointed and focused programs to ameliorate if you identify, for example, that there is a geographic area where poverty outcomes are not improving, directing more infrastructure, provision of public services to those areas. So we see a lot of scope to try and make sure that growth is more inclusive in many countries.
Do you think there are specific global headwinds, or what you call risks, that sub-Saharan Africa needs to pay particular attention to in short to medium term?
What is really striking is the volatility in the global economic environment facing many countries in the region. So take the case of commodity prices. Last year, commodity prices started, I think, at $67 per barrel. Oil prices started at $67 per barrel. They went up all the way to around 90, and then ended at 45 odd at the end of the year. So that's huge volatility in oil prices. Much in the same vein, you're seeing, we saw quite a lot of volatility over the last 6 to 9 months in global capital markets. So there was a big risk-off environment, capital flowing out of the region, borrowing costs very high. And then since the turn of the year, we've seen global financial markets doing much better and a lot of money returning to the region. So one of the tricky things for policymakers right now is navigating this significant volatility. So if you're an oil exporting country, how do you budget when oil prices are this volatile? If you're looking to tap markets either for financing or do a liability management operation, timing of market access becomes more difficult, more uncertain. So I think it requires policymakers to be more nimble and more aware of all of these changes. So that's one of the challenges that policymakers are facing.
Speak to us specifically about Nigeria.
Nigeria, one of the good things is that growth has recovered somewhat from the levels in recent years. But, at 2.8% or so, growth is still lower, than the potential that this giant of Africa has. So we see a lot of scope for Nigeria to be growing much higher rates than it currently is. And really, this requires two things in our view. First, of course, is that you need diversification in this economy. So, looking at the policies that are required to facilitate more private investment, I think is important. The kind of policies, of course, for example, I think, you cannot really have any diversification, any activities that require more higher level technology without electricity. So making sure that you have adequate energy supply, reforms that will facilitate that, I think is really, really paramount. So one big policy challenge we see is doing the reforms that will facilitate diversification and allow, more agricultural production, agriculture to move up the value chain. I think that's one set of reforms that are needed. And then the second set of reforms we think are really very important is, of course, around greater provision of public services by the government, providing more health, education services, providing more infrastructure, building more infrastructure. This requires resources for the government. So doing tax reforms, Nigeria has one of the lowest levels of non-oil tax revenue collection. So doing the reforms that are needed to generate more resources so the government can can spend more is also, I think, a very important policy requirement. So I think these two areas are what are going to be needed to facilitate and unleash the strong potential that this economy has.
On a final note, do you think sub-Saharan African economies are overborrowing? Both multilateral, Eurobond, whatever it is?
Again, I think, I really hesitate to generalize. The debt picture in the region is very varied. So in some countries, we've seen debt levels are not problematic. So if you take, the likes of Uganda, Tanzania at the moment, public debt levels are very manageable. In still other countries, you have seen a period where the government has been investing quite a lot on infrastructure, so debt levels have gone up. What's needed in those cases is to, as I noted earlier also, to basically strike a better balance between, on the one hand, continuing to invest, and then on the other hand, avoiding debt sustainability problems. So you need to recalibrate policies. So in those kind of economies, what they need is much more domestic revenue mobilization, to be able to, strike this balance better. And then in a few cases, we have seen debt levels rising to very uncomfortable levels. In those cases, stronger fiscal reforms are needed to reduce fiscal deficits, and that can come from the revenue side, but also in some cases from the spending side. So the picture is really very varied. And of course, you have to, things like debt sustainability analysis have to be done on a very country-specific basis.